Well, hello. Welcome, Clive. Good to see you again. We had lunch together 3 years ago.
Absolutely, yeah.
This is a reunion of sorts.
We bookended the pandemic.
That's
basically.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Let's start by talking about this book you wrote, Coders.
Yeah, sure.
So when I started at Stack Overflow 4.5 years ago, I knew a lot of people who wrote code.
Right.
But I was inundated with them when I started this job, right? Like Stack Overflow is full of coders.
Yeah.
I started going to all these conferences talking to coders. And it was tough to get them to open up to me.
Right.
But you've interviewed thousands of them. How did you get them to open up to you?
I think it helps a little bit that I'm a little bit like them. I mean, I'm an old school computer hacking nerd from like the 1980s, like with Commodore 64s and stuff like that. So I was a teenager when the whole sort of personal computation trend was coming along, and I got incredibly excited by this idea that you could have this machine that you could get to do exactly what you wanted to do, that there was these incantations you could use that would bring digital stuff to life. And so that sort of spark of excitement has been with me for a really long time. And so it really helps to sort of have experienced that, and to feel it when you're talking to other developers, because I think that it really helps me understand exactly what motivates them. It's a weird class of people, right? Like these are folks who are engineers building machines, but entirely with logic and inside their minds. So I have a deep excitement and respect for that I think is maybe a little contagious. Secondarily, I think that I kind of like the personality type of people that are drawn to this. There's many introverts, and not all introverts. There's many that are deeply, logically minded, not entirely, not exclusively, but often that. And I find their minds really interesting. I find the personalities really engaging, and I also respect the way that they think and work. Like a lot of journalism, you sort of show up and you're like immediately shaking the hand and doing the glad handing stuff, and that does not work so well with developers. Often I find the way that they like to communicate, and I deal with that. So with some developers, I would spend weeks or months just text chatting, for a long time, about stuff, going deep, before I would ever meet them face to face, because that's just how they get comfortable with someone. Right. Sometimes I never even met them. That was entirely the way we talked, but we had amazing conversations. And I think the last thing, and this is just kind of a general, life skill, I guess, is, and it's a thing you do a lot in reporting, is, you just ask people questions and listen to what they have to say. And I would often find a lot of developers would say, yeah, no one ever asks me any questions at work. No one ever listens to what I have to say. And so in this very simple way, just literally being interested in someone and what they're doing, and being excited by it and paying attention to it, is really powerful.
And one of the questions you like to ask is like, what's gone wrong, right? Like you'd like to ask about things that break. What's that about?
Yeah, one of my favorite questions is always like, all right, so what's the worst bug? And I've heard the most amazing stories this way, right? Because everyone has these just absolutely epic. I've actually thought of doing an anthology just of the worst bug stories, because I have this huge, sort of file of like hair-raising, crazy stuff. People who deleted entire databases, stuff that completely fell apart on stage. And so yes, there's some kind of fun stories that will really unlock the sort of the torture of coding, right? Like it's an incredibly, I have this chapter in my book called Constant Frustration and Bursts of Joy, because that's kind of what coding is, right? It's just like non-stop frustration, and then suddenly something works, and you get 5 minutes of triumph before you have just another, weeks or months of frustration. And so finding the moments when you can get those stories out is really exciting and a lot of fun for all parties.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we talked a little bit about the traditional developer, probably the developer that's represented in like the Mr. Robots and the hackers of the world, but the profile of the coder is certainly changing.
Yeah.
And that change has been accelerated over the past few years. Mm-hmm. How do you think the profile of the coder is going to change in like 10, 15 years?
Well, that's a really good question, and I spent a lot of time asking people what they think about that, because the industry is very keenly concerned with that question. I mean, on the top level, like at the high level of coding, people doing big systems engineering and whatnot, I think some of that pipeline is going to stay the same. It's going to be CS degrees, worldwide, and so we'll see the similar type of pipeline that we see for coders now in the future. One of the things that's going to change, though, is that there is increasingly this sort of sea of people who are sort of code adjacent, just below people that are full-time developers, right? And that's being catalyzed by the fact that there's these emerging tool sets that allow people that are not, developers and don't consider themselves to be developers, to do some sort of automations of their business logic. So maybe you are in accounts receivable and you've got a bunch of this grunt work that you've got to do, and it's a pain in the butt, and it would be great if you had a developer who could write a process for you, but you aren't given those resources. And so you sort of staple together something with Zapier, or maybe Google Spreadsheets, maybe a little bit of scripting, but some sort of low code and no code tools. And lo and behold, you sort of create something that is basically an application catered to whatever weird problem you have. That type of behavior has always been there. That's what sort of Microsoft Visual Basic was always for. But there's a lot more out there right now. Again, Zapier, Google Sheets, Grist, and there's a lot of tools for learning a little bit of coding, like Replit or Glitch or whatnot. So I think we're going to see this massive explosion of stuff that's just this sort of almost 10x the size of the population of coders doing this code adjacent stuff, for good and for ill. For good, there'll be a lot more people being able to automate things that is great for them and take some of the pressure off the coders to have to do that stuff for them. The downside is some of it's going to be really rickety, weird crap, right? I've had people show me these Microsoft Visual Basic scripts that are 10,000 lines long. That is just some crazy hairball of global variables just bonking up against one another, and yet it's been running their company. Their 7-person company for 10 years, and at any moment it's going to fall apart. What we're sort of going to see is probably a lot more stuff kind of like that, coming out of this growing huge world of code adjacent people.
Yeah, and what about certainly in some countries, but in some communities and some pockets of the world, there is coding curriculums now. People are learning to code younger. It's been gamified. Yep. It's built into toys. How is that changing things?
I mean, that I think is very good for a bunch of reasons. One is that it's having these, demographically, certainly in the U.S., there's been this challenge of the fact that coding has had all sorts of problems with representation and has historically been a track mostly for sort of young white dudes. And part of that was that there weren't enough tendrils out there in these sort of pre-college level saying, hey, do you want to try this thing, this weird task of telling a machine to do something, that you want it to do, and to figure out whether you are one of these kids that gets that electric thrill. Because not everyone does. Some people are like, oh, yeah, I did my Hello World, I don't care. And other people are like, I feel like Prometheus, Yeah. And those are the ones that are going to go on to become really good developers. And they're kind of distributed demographically all over the place. 5% of any given cohort is going to be like that, but you have to give them the opportunity to figure out that they're one of the people that just feels that electric thrill. So the fact that there's been more of these sort of these tools online and after-school programs and things aimed at kids globally, I think is really, really good, because it's one of these key tools that's allowing people to figure out that they're the ones that want to do this. It also requires, educational systems to be open to a bigger range of people who present themselves as, I want to do coding. You're definitely seeing that changing. I mean, I think the educational systems are helping. And globally, though, the pictures, I think is really interesting, because different countries have very different statuses for where development is, right? If you go to, India is a mammoth country with a ton of developers, and they're, demographically a lot younger than the rest of the country. They're very interested in mobile. If you go to places like China or Sri Lanka, even parts of Asia, you get far more women that are getting into coding, and that's largely because for a bunch of cultural reasons, their parents and the people around them are encouraging them in a way that is maybe not happening so much in the United States. So in many ways, actually, I think every country could probably learn something from observing what the other countries are good at doing and bad at doing. The one interesting concern I think that every country is going to have is that there's sort of like a supply and demand problem at the college and university level, because of exactly what you're talking about, these programs, after-school programs, online things that are encouraging people to figure out, yes, I'm one of the people that really loves to develop, I want to do that. There's more people, and they're flooding into the colleges, and the colleges do not have enough seats, right? This is a huge problem. It's happened a couple different times in the past. If you were to look in the United States at the sort of interest in going to do a CS degree, you'd see this growing interest in the 80s that reaches this huge peak and then crashes. And why does it crash? Well, partly because they ran out of seats for people, and they started actively pushing people away. They're like, we can't handle so many people. They started putting up roadblocks, literally putting up, you must jump this high to get in there. And so there's this very, very challenging moment we're having right now. A lot of people globally are realizing, I want to do this. Maybe it's for economic reasons. Maybe it's for, I just love doing this reasons. But the systems are straining to deal with that load, and I'm a little worried that we're going to have another sort of moment when they start putting up barriers to chase people away. And this is not something I've made up. This is scholars who study this are worried about this. So that's the challenge right now, I would say.
So you've talked about the demand issues that exist. You've talked about the sort of people learning to code in droves, choosing careers in development. So what about, as people often like to talk about, automation, AI, ML? Are the concerns overblown? What's going to happen there?
Sure. This one is interesting because last year, beginning in the summer, I got access to Copilot, OpenAI's, coding AI, and I used it for 6 or 7 months. And I'm not a professional coder, but I do a lot of sort of development of scripting tools for my journalism, and that could be something as simple as here's a massive pile of PDFs that all have a certain type of tabular data, scrape it out, format it for me, put it in a spreadsheet, or it could be little automators or website scrapers and whatnot. So I was using it, and I was like everyone else, kind of amazed at how good it was. It was you would give it some task, and you had to sort of learn how to talk to it. But once you learned how to talk to it, it was shockingly good at letting you develop really quickly, and it gave that sort of eerie feeling of, wow, is this finally the moment when AI is going to take over the task of development? The conclusion I came to, having talked to a lot of different developers who'd use this AI, is that I don't think it's going to put anyone fully out of a job, but it's going to change the nature of what maybe development means. And this partly has to do with what I was talking about with that sort of sea of people who are code adjacent and maybe not full-time developers. It's going to be something that sort of, I think, is going to superpower them, because I spoke to people who are building companies who were like, okay, we could take, we've got something that's like a WordPress style make your website thing. And people have always used it that were not coders, and they built websites, but they've always wanted to do more. They've wanted to have some automation in there that they would have to build themselves in PHP or JavaScript or whatever. And they can't do that, and we can't do it for them. But now they're beginning to think, well, maybe we could add Copilot-style AI. So you could say, well, I need this logic to do this thing for me. And suddenly you're becoming someone who's working much more like a developer because you've got this AI helping you out. And maybe that does unemploy or underemploy the sort of coder who you might pay $500 for on Fiverr to build that logic for you. But probably it's also going to just open up new capabilities for people that are full-time developers to sort of get rid of some of the grunt work to allow them to punch above their weight too. I talk to all sorts of developers, who are very seasoned people who are just yeah, I'm just able to sort of go 2x faster, because what it's really doing is it's taking that time that I would spend going to Stack Overflow and looking up how to do something, because it knows that. So it'll just, oh, here's the library you need, here's the structure for its API. So that's really interesting. There's a second issue about AI though that's less about is it going to unemploy coders, but almost about the question of where geographically the power politics of where AI is being developed lies. Because right now, when I talk to people globally, there's a lot of concern in countries outside, in the global south, outside the West, that a lot of the AI development is in a couple of hotspots. It's in parts of the US, a little bit in Toronto in Canada. It's in the UK, it's in Germany, it's in Japan, and it's heavily in China. And because it requires such enormous resources to the way they're currently developing AI, to sort of push the limits of it, it requires massive compute, it requires huge amounts of energy, it's very expensive. A lot of these other areas feel like they're maybe getting left behind, and that they're going to be relegated to sort of consuming the APIs for the AI that these other countries make. And that's a really disempowered situation. Like maybe 7 or 8 years ago, they felt kind of excited, like TensorFlow was open source, and they're like, oh, we here can roll up and train an AI that's just as good as something that someone's doing in San Francisco or Boston or London. And now they're feeling more like, great, I can subscribe to a really high-end AI that's been developed in Beijing or San Francisco, but like that's not really great for the stock of our coding. Like, we're going to be sitting around, doing prompt engineering instead of actual engineering. So that's an interesting challenge, and I don't really know any way out of it, because at the moment, the frontiers of AI are all being explored in this very highly capitalized way that requires massive resources, massive energy. And I don't see that changing in the near-term future, unless there are some major structural paradigm shifts in what AI is and how it's developed.
Yeah, well, one of the paradigm shifts that's accelerated that trend has been the pandemic.
Oh yeah.
So what we have to talk, we're contractually obligated to talk about it, I feel like.
Yes.
What have you seen that's changed over the past couple of years that's here to stay?
Well, the big one is remote work, and the fact that a lot of developers absolutely love it, right? So like, it's probably no surprise to anyone listening in here that developers really treasure being able to get into the flow state. I can't believe I actually said the name of your conference, but there we go. My check is in the mail. They treasure being able to get into those like 7-hour-long periods, because it's such a weird task, development, because you have to sort of, your working memory is taxed to its absolute limit. Like, you have to sort of look at this problem that you're dealing with and load it into your mind and ponder it, and that can take like 2 or 3 hours just to get to the point where you can even begin to do complicated work. And so if someone organizes a meeting or walks in your cubicle and like says, hey, can I ask you a question? They can just completely short circuit what you spent 3 hours getting into. Now you have to start all over again. And so developers have always wanted to have these longer periods of work, and a lot of them really got it during COVID, because they had to keep up with Slack, they had to do Zoom meetings, but they had more control of their schedule, and they love it, and they don't want to go back. The challenge that this is facing for companies is that that's great for people that are a little further on their career, but it's not so great for people that are being onboarded, like new college grads, because a lot of companies, big companies, would try and get these fresh faces sort of acclimatized to the way their company works. Just even like sort of just the craft of like how do we check stuff in and out, and what do our systems look like? They just sit that person next to a senior engineer for 3 months, and they'd shoulder surf, and they'd learn all this tacit knowledge. And that's really how you take like a junior dev and you give them a lot of skills. And you can't do that as easily with the pandemic. In fact, I've heard a lot of senior people that are trying to do that shoulder surfing, trying to do that training, say we're sort of at our wits' end. We don't know how to like fully onboard and fully give career development to these young people. So this is this weird challenge. There's a lot of people right in the middle of development that do not want to go back to the office, and there's a lot of people at the high end and at the entry level that would desperately want to get back there. And companies are struggling to figure out how to square that circle.
And just double clicking on this concept of developer experience, hybrid working, context switching, and everything else. As you talk to developers at companies, which companies are doing this really well, and what are they doing that's different?
Well, I don't know if anyone is doing it really well, frankly. I mean, I feel like everyone I talk to feels like they're still just patching it together. But to the extent that I have heard people say I'm happy with the way things are, they seem to have settled upon a system whereby there are a few periods a week when people are expected to be in the office so that they can do that face-to-face synchronization that happens more quickly when you're face-to-face. And the rest of the week, everyone can go wherever they want. If they want to work in the office, they can. Like if their home, is just tiny and they've got, not a lot of place to work or a lot of other people there, they can use the office, but they don't have to. And what's interesting, here's what's really interesting, is that those people seem very happy with that when they can work it out. It tends to be at smaller and mid-sized companies, because I think the really large companies have trouble dealing with, it feels to them too scattershot, whereas if you have 50 people, you can actually sort of work that out. And what's really interesting is that it resembles stuff that I was hearing about 5 years ago. Like even before the pandemic, people were saying, well, we've realized the best way to get our developers best work is to have this thing where Tuesday and Thursday from 10 until 3 you have to be in the office, the rest of the week go wherever you want. That's exactly what a bunch of them settled on after the pandemic. So it feels like maybe that's actually the local minima, right? That's actually where you should be. I don't know if it works for all companies. I think large companies have very specific problems just because 10,000 people, it's hard to get them to row in the same direction. That's the best information I've heard so far.
Yeah, helpful, thank you. And then just again, looking forward 10, 15 years from now, what do you think are some of the trends that people are certainly talking about automation? They're talking about the technical talent shortage. What aren't people talking about that you wish that they were?
Well, I think one of the things that there's been a burgeoning conversation about almost sort of the ethics and social role of code, right? There was this fascinating survey. It was done. I can't remember who this was done by. One of the large companies sort of survey has does hiring stuff. It's a little bit like the Stack Overflow survey, except they asked if you were asked to write to work in an application that the function of which you consider to be completely unethical, would you do it? and it was interesting. A significant minority said, yes, I would. They didn't explore any further why that was, but it was probably some combination of I just need the money. You got to do what you got to do. It's kind of like when journalists go and work for tobacco firms, because they just need the money. So one of the things I think that is not talked about enough. At an industry level, and yet when I talk about it individually with developers, they are often, troubled by it, or they're not sure what to think about it, is what is the ethics of their work and how it pertains to the world at large? And what's really interesting is that there are forms of engineering that have had to face this in the past, right? So there's this great paper that was done years ago that was looking at the reaction of physicists to the Manhattan Project and the atom bomb. And because before then, up until the atom bomb, physicists were really just like, well, we're just figuring out vectors of movement and exploring the basic nature of reality, and it's cool. Like it doesn't have any particular politics attached to it. And then the atom bomb happened, and they were like, oh wow, what we do has a mammoth effect on the world. And so over the next couple decades, this is the argument of this paper, physicists developed like a kind of a rigorous set of ethics for themselves, to the point where in the 1980s, when you had these campus movements to try and to divest from South Africa, people are saying, look, Harvard, you've got $2 billion invested, a bunch of it's in South Africa. We want you to divest to show that apartheid is bad. Most of the professors were like, yeah, I'm not signing on that. And all the physics professors would. They're like, yeah, absolutely, here's my name, no more questions. And the argument was, well, this was an industry that had a sort of a moment of clarity, as an alcoholic would call it, and had to realize the ethical implications of what they do. It feels to me, when I talk to a lot of developers, that there's been this kind of moment of clarity, partly from looking at kind of the crap show of social media online and some of the things they worry about what it's done to society. Surveillance and how much code is involved in scooping up personal information, and they're uneasy about it. So I feel like they want to have an ethical conversation that they don't have any, that their professional organizations and their companies don't want to have. And so there's some sort of discontent that I think really should be addressed. I'm not saying all developers want that, but enough of them, when I talk to them, like, have this unease, and they're like, I don't know where to go with these feelings or these conversations. So that's an interesting one. Yeah.
And then before we have a number of questions from folks, which I'll ask you next. But just before we get there, on a happier note, Prashant shared in the beginning of the day, and we certainly see on Stack Overflow that one sort of thread that runs through all developers is they love to learn, and it's an imperative for their job.
Yes.
So how have you seen that manifested in the conversations you've had, and like the most engaged, the most successful developers? How have they embodied that quality?
Yeah, this point about learning is incredibly central to developers, and is maybe even a little singular, because like there's not a lot of other professions where after 40 or 50 hours of your labor, the way you relax in the evening is by doing more of that labor, right? Like I don't think lawyers are like, oh, I really want to do more law, Friday night, and yet every developer is like, I can't wait to get home to write drivers for this obscure like 3D mouse controller that I found from 1997 that I can't get working anymore,
Right.
Like, and they're like, oh my God, this is gonna be the best moment of my week. And so like this is, any other industry would kill to have people who are that excited by the craft of what they do that they voluntarily will learn stuff all the time. So what I hear when I talk to a lot of developers is they wish there was more opportunities to learn within their company and to do something new within their company. And I think actually the managers get that. I mean, good technical managers know this. They know, if they're technical, they know it about themselves, frankly. I once spoke to Ray Ozzie, who was the senior software developer for Microsoft, and he literally, like, he'd been like 20 years just in management. He hadn't written any code in a long time. He's like, I still dream about my last commit for Lotus 123, So I don't know anyone that has a good answer to it, but to the extent that you can find a way to have the developers learn new stuff and maybe even use that stuff that they've learned new inside the company, it will make them much happier.
So there are some questions that relate to that, some good, interesting audience questions. One that I saw come in is about how live streaming has sort of changed coding. Do you see like Twitch and live coding on YouTube as being an effective way for people to onboard or learn to code, or like what is driving the popularity here?
That's an amazing question, because the answer is yes. I have been surprised how many people I've spoken to, even senior devs, who watch live streaming or code tutorials on YouTube. And I've been surprised how much I do it myself, right? So if I'm trying to learn a library or something, I'll look at the documentation, but at some point in time I'll go like, well, has anyone done this? And I'll look at it, and I'm like, why am I learning more watching this person do this on screen than I was reading the docs, right? And I think it's because we think of coding as something that is, entirely mental and internal, and we're just sort of, levitating this crystal palace in our heads. But there's a lot of it that's actually kind of kinesthetic and visual too, right? Even just like seeing like what type of error messages that you can ignore that pour across the screen is significant, right? So I think live streaming and code videos have been incredibly catalytic and are really a force for good.
Nice. So it was mentioned earlier that colleges don't have enough CS seats. This creates a more competitive environment to get in the door. But what role will autodidactism have as a result?
Well, teaching yourself has always had a big role in coding. And like, again, this is one of the things that makes it a really unique and weird discipline. Like, if you go to Boeing and say, well, who are your senior people building your 747s? They don't have a trained PhD along with a guy who just built a bunch of planes in his backyard and got good at it and then showed up at Boeing. Right. And yet that's exactly what like you might find in a senior dev team, like, PhD from MIT and, someone who started, building websites for her friends' bands and then became like a JavaScript, superstar, and now has written all these libraries. So that to me is really interesting. I think that there will always be a role for autodidacts, in part because even if you've got the PhD, you still have to learn new things. You still have to teach yourself new things. So there's autodidactism all the time. But I will say that not all companies are good at figuring out how to value people that taught themselves the stuff, right? Like, they're still, as much as as much as coding is less credentialist than other things, companies still go for the big name, schools, and it's a real challenge. How to figure out how to get them to look past it. I find that the mid-sized and small companies weirdly can be sometimes better at going, okay, you know this stuff, we're going to go for it. We don't care if you went to Stanford.
Yeah. The next question asks, as a manager of software engineers, what is the #1 thing I can do to keep my developers happy, productive, and they said in the flow state. I'm not editing the question there. And in the flow state.
Sorry, repeat that one again.
As a manager of my joke, got you. As a manager of software engineers, what's the #1 thing I can do to keep my developers happy, productive, and in the flow state?
I think it is respecting the need that they have for periods of deep, uninterrupted work, right? And this goes back to, Paul Graham wrote that famous essay, manage your time versus maker time. And everyone has mentioned some version of that to me, which is that, the people that are happy are ones that have managers that say, okay, I know where you're at, and I know that you need this time just to crank and get this work done, and you're gonna have no meetings and no check-ins, apart from these few that are timed, almost bookending large amounts of time. That is an absolutely central thing, and I've seen it over and over again in teams where the managers like what the developers are doing, the developers like what the managers are doing. It's respect for the time constraints of the job.
This question's a little long, but it's super interesting, and at its core it asks, will the quality of the code that we produce decline through the rise of remote work? And so the best quality control for code is other people's use and reaction to it. Will that suffer through remote work? We might be more productive, but will we create horrible stuff to use faster?
Yeah, that is an absolutely fantastic question. It also cuts to the use of AI-assisted tools, right? A lot of people were telling me okay, I'm a good developer, but if this allows me to work 2x fast, does that just mean now I'm going to produce more crappy code or more baggy floppy code because I can do it faster? I don't know if I actually have an answer for that. I mean, I would say that developers who can do a bit of shoulder surfing with each other can often solve problems really fast, because there's something about two eyes on a piece of code, on a function, that seems to work way faster than two people who are physically separate. And just because there's a speed, the bus rate of communication is really high when you're next to each other, and you can sort of point and get this joint attention, well this and that. So it may be that this is correct, and that we see problems. I don't know for sure though.
Well, one thing we talk a lot about at Stack Overflow is just with Stack Overflow for Teams, the context behind the code exists there.
Yeah.
So having sort of a wiki, but a much more sophisticated version is helpful in that sense.
Without question, absolutely. Yeah.
So the next question is about the disconnect between developers and companies and the conversations that they're having about ethics. Have you seen this successfully addressed anywhere, and what can leaders do to help? One area I wonder about is climate change and sustainability, for example.
Absolutely. Climate change and sustainability is really interesting because one of the things you've seen is there have been developers who've sort of objected strongly to companies that wanted to do some sort of crypto NFT thing, and particularly in gaming. You actually had a bunch of gaming companies that were like, we're going to do NFTs, and this is before the merge, so when Ethereum was still, chewing through a huge amount of carbon. And there was a bunch of developers that were like, no way in hell. That is not going to improve our game in any way. And it's only going to contribute to something that I care deeply about. So that was a very interesting moment, and you saw these this consilience between the people who played the games and the people who were developing the games, that they were like, this is absolute crap from above. So I think that was a really interesting example of kind of a successful moment, because almost not many of those big gaming companies quickly backed away from their NFTization ideas, basically. I mean, it'll probably come back now that the merge has happened, but it was an interesting ethical moment.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think this is actually a great question to close on with 1 minute left. So coding culture has historically been a bit of an underground nerdy niche. How do you think it's changed culturally as it's become more mainstream? Has it shaped society, or has society shaped it?
I think society has shaped it, actually. That's a great way of putting it. I think that you know, I mean, like in the 1980s, if you were coding, the idea that code could shape society, you know, I understood it because I was a nerd that did the stuff, and other nerds understood it, but the average person didn't. Once you got past the internet and the iPhone and stuff, the average person was like, oh, I see. Code is a fulcrum for changing society. And if you want to have an effect, this is a good way to get into it. And so you can actually see this, you know, with like everything from interest rates to CS majors, like the diversification of who's going after it has just skyrocketed in the, you know, in the late 2000, in the sort of mid to late 2010s. So I think that like the fact that there's been, you know, a diversification of people that are saying I want to get into this has been good for coding itself, and I think that's exactly the way it's working. The embrace or understanding of the power of code by the rest of society outside the nerdy class, like, you know, like me in the 80s, is helping to change, I think, really for the better, the nature of coding itself.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Clive.
Oh, no, a great
really
time.
appreciate it. All right.